This is episode 296 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week in studio by David Clements. David, many different ways we know each other, but most notably, you ran for the U.S. Senate once upon a time, and you're from the southern part of our state, New Mexico State University in Las Cruces. So welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, David.
Thank you for having me. I crashed a Liberty on the Rocks event when I ran for office, and that was the first time I met you.
Okay, well, briefly, tell us about that particular campaign, because it has been a few years.
Yeah, I basically was in my driveway drinking an IPA happy camper and was looking at the potential candidates. And like many, I was very, very tired with getting the same old, big government types. And so I decided to throw my hat in the ring. I didn't know if I would last 2 weeks, let alone 3 weeks, but ended up giving the person I ran against a run for his money up until the primary. I didn't win the primary, but ultimately I was trying to get at Tom Udall. So that's brief.
Yeah, no future political interests, or you're certainly making some waves in national context. I mean, I'm not going to ask you if you're going to announce for governor tomorrow or anything, but is that a bug that has been fully satiated, or is there a possibility that you'd run again?
Well, there was a lot of turmoil attached to my race. I put it this way: most people that were political commentators would say that I wasn't supposed to get on the ballot, and I got on the ballot, and I nearly won the state convention. I was 48 votes shy of winning the convention. Leading up to that, there was some controversy here in Bernalillo County. The pre-primary convention, basically, there was an illegal slate of 30 delegates that got on board. I challenged that. The local party agreed with me, and then afterwards they changed their mind. I think some big money donors were saying, we're not going to unseat these folks. Be that as it may, fraud was committed, and I called it out. And about 2 days later, the email that I sent out to folks saying that fraud was committed here in Bernalillo County kept circulating over and over again. I mean, people were emailing me like, David, why are you sending the same email again and again? And I said, I'm not. So I ended up doing some research into it, and wouldn't you know that the campaign manager of my opponent had hacked my email and was basically mass blasting till people either unsubscribed or told me they weren't going to vote for me. So all of this led up, and then I was sued for telling the truth. I was sued for defamation because I called this person out for cheating and for hacking me. So that was my experience with the race, and I'm happy to say that 2 years later I had that case dismissed with prejudice, and to this day can tell everyone that I was hacked. But that was my introduction to politics. So I wouldn't say that it was that the itch has been scratched fully, but that's a hell of an entrance into politics.
No doubt, yes. And the reason that I wanted to have you on is because you've been, we'll just call it hobnobbing. You've been having conversations with a lot of interesting people, well-known people, specifically Tucker Carlson recently, but you've talked to Steve Bannon and a lot of folks in the Trump orbit, so to speak. Now, like I said, I mean, our paths mostly crossed, several years ago when you were running for the Senate. You're in, academia. You're talk about your career.
Oh, I'm a professor of business law and consumer protection at New Mexico State University, and prior to that, I was a trial attorney and a deputy district attorney. I ran Lincoln County and did a bunch of prosecutions there. Probably tried anywhere from 120 to 160 jury trials. And before that, I was in civil litigation, so I worked for a business firm.
All right, and you, despite all that lawyerly experience, you're I would describe you as a liberty guy. You're you know, I don't know, fairly libertarian, if not outright libertarian. You ran as a Republican when you ran for the Senate, but you're definitely in that liberty mix.
Yeah, for sure. I'm a, my journey, I wouldn't even say that we all hate labels, but we all have to kind of suffer through them. But I guess my journey towards liberty was accidental in some respects. When I was in law school, my long paper thesis was to study the causes of the 2008 Great Recession. And then I wanted to ask the question whether or not the Federal Reserve had ever received a full audit. And once you go down that rabbit hole, you figure out all the questions that people are asking about pork barrel spending, or $1 million for this special interest group, or $1 million for this special interest group, paled in comparison to this fact that over $8 trillion went somewhere and the Inspector General couldn't tell us where. And so I started asking these big money questions. And when you start researching the Federal Reserve, you can't help but come into contact with former Congressman Ron Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got an education from this medical doctor on the Constitution, and it was compelling. And so that was my introduction. And then I knew Gary Johnson, and I thought as a governor, libertarian guy, did a great job. So I had these two, not really, I say there's big differences between the two, but I liked the way that he governed, and I liked the way that Ron Paul was basically a watchman for our rights. And I'm probably somewhere in the middle.
Okay. Yeah. We could have a whole podcast about the myriad similarities and differences between the Ron Paul wing of the libertarian movement and the Gary Johnson wing of the libertarian movement. Of course, that does conveniently dovetail us into the 2016 election, which of course Donald Trump won. I think I saw somewhere that you, like myself, did not vote for Donald J. Trump in the 2016 election. I'll give you the floor. What reasons did you have at that time for not jumping on the Trump train, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, one, I was a state chair for Gary Johnson's presidential race.
Oh, that'll do it.
And I don't agree with Gary on a handful of issues. I'm a pro-life guy, so it's kind of hard there because that's a non-negotiable position for me. But I believe him to be a humble man. I believe him to be an honest man. And again, I had 8 years here where I could look at his work and say, okay, I think he would, even if I'm pro-life and he's not, I was hoping that he would be someone that would be in favor of decentralization and let that policy work take place here in the state as opposed to the federal government. Trump, to me, was he was a former Democrat, and he was saying all the right things even during the campaign, but I just didn't believe him. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was kind of the lesser of evils, which I've always kind of pushed back against. I don't think you should vote for evil, but having the benefit of 4 years hindsight, had I known that President Trump would have been the president that he eventually became, I probably would have voted for him in 2016. But I looked at the media reports, and a lot of the stuff that you look at, it's like, do I really want to vote for this guy? And I think I was a little bit brainwashed because everything that I was hearing about Trump, I wasn't hearing directly from him. I was hearing it from CNN and some of the other places. Well, about a year ago, I just shut off all those sources, and I just started listening to him, the man. And so I guess I went from a never Trumper to someone who proudly voted for President Trump based on what he did. And so that was a tough pill to swallow in some ways because I was very critical of the man. I didn't like the rhetoric. I didn't like a lot about him. And so I actually wrote a lot of op-eds that were highly critical of him in my advocacy for Gary Johnson. And now if I had the opportunity to vote for him again, I don't think I'd hesitate.
Well, just so we can be on even terms here, I voted for him in 2020, did not vote for him in 2016. I thought he did a pretty decent job as president. Certainly, looking back at the last 3-4 months of Biden, there's no comparison. I do wish that Trump would have, especially there was a lot of things you got to separate the policies from the persona. And Trump's downfall in many ways after the election was, in what we're going to talk about here, in January 6th and the riots and all that stuff. And we can talk about some of that, all of that. This is a unique podcast for us because we normally focus so exclusively on New Mexico. But since you've been doing so much in the national sphere, and talking with some of these big names and talking about some pretty explosive issues, it's definitely a conversation I wanted to have. But the Georgia special elections were just a killer, and I think Trump mistakenly, misguidedly, kind of pushed Republicans not to go and show up for those Georgia Senate seats, and now we've really got an empowered Biden administration in office. I'm not so excited about Trump. I thought he really let spending get out of control. I thought he really let Fauci bully him in the early days of the coronavirus. But I was actually much more impressed with his general regard for the Constitution, for limited government, than I was before he ran in 2016. So we're on many of the same parallels, just different aspects and strings that we're pulling out.
Yeah, look, the reason why I didn't vote for him is because a lot of the fears that people shared about him, I shared. And I thought that, the pandemic would have been the perfect opportunity for him to become the nationalist authoritarian that everyone was warning us of. And he actually didn't approach it that way. And in some ways, as you mentioned, he wasn't as strongly positioned against Dr. Fauci. But I think so it cuts both ways. We want someone to have that strong voice, to speak truth to power with respect to liberty. But he didn't become the authoritarian when he probably had the chance, and that was comforting. As far as Georgia, I really don't have a lot of sympathy for the Republicans in that, and that's because I think Loeffler and Perdue really sold out President Trump. He campaigned hard for them. And when we had whatever we want to say what happened with November 3rd, they were absent and really the Republican Party has been absolutely silent on the front of fighting for a president that really helped them pick up all kinds of seats across the country. And so I think that it had less to do with Trump being vocal in that runoff race than there was than the reason being election fraud. And, for instance, Javon Hutton Pulitzer was able to hack the runoff election real time. And we were all told you can't access these machines through the internet. Well, if that's happening, I'm sorry, why aren't we investigating that?
Right. So before we jump down that, we can call it a rabbit hole, we can call it whatever we want. But if people are interested, you've done a lot of mostly YouTube videos, and you haven't been taken down yet. So kudos.
I was.
Have you? Okay.
I'm back up, but I was taken
All
down.
right. So how do people find out more about some of the interviews and things that you've done? Because like I said, you have talked, and we're getting into this election issue, although the interview with Tucker Carlson was more directly related to NMSU. So we should probably talk about that first. But how do people find out? I just put it in YouTube, your name, David Clements. Do you have other avenues for people to find out more about you? Or
Sure. Yeah, I do. I've got a website called theprofessorsrecord.com, all one word. They can also find me on Telegram, The Professor's Record. I've got a Rumble channel, The Professor's Record. And then you can find me on Facebook. I'm not a public figure there, but professorsrecord.com is the website. And I've got a compilation of election update videos. I've discussed critical race theory, some of the things that are near and dear to my heart at the university. And I've tried to find people that have worked on the election lawsuits, that personally worked on them or filled out affidavits. So this isn't like once removed analysis. These are people that have actually done the forensic reports or have done some of the computer forensics or the mathematical analysis.
All right. So yeah, The Professor's Record, very attractive, nicely done website. Did you do that all by yourself?
I did. The story behind that is I was posting up cases and affidavits and stuff, and then Facebook would basically flag them and take them down. So it got to the point where I basically had to build a website just to put them up and store them.
Okay, so you land on Tucker Carlson now. Tucker Carlson show that was specifically about something that happened at New Mexico State. So tell us a little bit about that. What was the interview with Tucker Carlson all about?
Well, preceding that interview, I've sat in on these anti-racism, anti-discrimination meetings ever since the George Floyd event, and I got to see like the inside track of academia really creating basically just it's very, very politicized. We'll just put it that way. And in any event, some things that were said, and I promise I'm going to tie this to your direct question, but this is the background. But there were faculty members that were saying, look, we have to make sure that white males don't get certain positions. And I'm in these meetings. They don't know. They look at me and they think that I'm some liberal professor. And so they're just talking and I'm taking notes and I'm sitting there going, wow, as an attorney, that's violative of state law. There's case decisions, but they didn't care. And so I was kind of stunned by just the political activism that was going on in what were supposed to be representative positions where we represent the faculty voice. In any event, we got to the point where the presidential election was coming up. I don't talk politics in my classroom. I don't talk politics at all. I just teach them what I teach them. But there was a very, very vocal segment, and we've got this thing called faculty talk. So you've got about 1,000 different academics on the listserv, and they're talking about everything but academics. It's just politics. And a lot of it is just tearing down Trump. And again, I didn't really care. I didn't really speak up. But at some point after Trump allegedly lost the election, all kinds of stuff was coming out. There was a particular politician here in the state that was calling for Trump supporters to be branded with a scarlet S. There were faculty members that were equating anyone that voted for Trump as a racist, insurrectionist, or someone who's treasonous. And I thought, well, this is just terrible for faculty members to say this because at least half the faculty are probably Trump voters and at least half the student population were probably conservative. I mean, you have to keep in mind that NMSU is not Cal Berkeley. This is a ranching, agricultural, engineering school. You certainly have your more liberal elements to it. But you look at the classroom and people just, you could tell they felt stifled. They told me that they're worried about their grades, that they don't say the right things or have the right opinions. And now we've got someone that's equating anyone that voted for him as basically the equivalent of following Hitler. And with that, I called for civility through the faculty listserv. Like, hey, can we just cut down on the rhetoric? If you want unity, let's not do this. Well, as soon as I did this, this small vocal element of, I call them Marxist professors, just went search and destroy. They started doing research on me. They started figuring out that I had ran for office before. I was a Republican county chairman at one point, but this was like years ago. And just went after me. And so I'm like, okay, so this is the climate that I'm in. Fast forward to the 6th, which is the date of the
January 6th. Yep.
January 6th, the so-called riot. And within 2 hours, everyone had their narrative set up for what happened. Who's to blame? President Trump. Who breached the Capitol? His followers. And I thought that was odd because being someone that was in law enforcement, you don't have an answer 2 hours later. But Mitch McConnell had an answer. Kelly Loeffler had an answer. And within 24 hours, every university president in the country had an answer about what happened and who did it. And so I was shocked because right now we're still waiting for the FBI to give us their report. They asked for a 60-day extension. Yet that didn't stop anyone from starting impeachment proceedings. So this is due process that was just run amok. I saw several videos of Antifa members admitting to their participation in there. And so I just basically couldn't sleep one night. I posted my video. I thought it'd be seen by the president of my university because he asked for feedback. And the faculty member saying that you've rushed to judgment. You don't know. We still don't know. and that video became viral, and that was where I got the invite to go on Tucker Carlson's show. And so I just happened to mention in that video that I'd also looked at all of the cases and felt that there was compelling evidence of election fraud, not just voter fraud, but election fraud. And at that point, that led to the opportunity to work with Steve Bannon and others.
Yeah, and if you go to David's YouTube channel or the Professor's Record, you can find a wide variety of videos. And Steve Bannon's somebody I'm familiar with. His name, you've interviewed and sat down with him. You've talked to Lin Wood. For those not familiar with Lin Wood, Lin Wood, what is his? He was an attorney with Trump during the kind of election recount. But what is his?
Well, Lin Wood was until he publicly supported Trump for president, was widely regarded as the greatest defamation attorney in the country. He represented Richard Jewell. That was the gentleman that Clint Eastwood filmed the movie about. Lin Wood was his attorney when the FBI unfairly investigated, and basically it was a flash mob conviction where he represented him. He represented the MAGA kid, the Covington kid, got a huge settlement. Can't disclose the amount against CNN. But if you had a defamation case, Lin Wood was the guy that you'd want on your team. So I've just come to admire his courage and his willingness to speak his mind. But like me, he not only committed the cardinal sin of voting for Trump, but he's doubled down and he's not apologizing for it. And so the Georgia bar isn't too happy with him.
Okay, and you talked to this Jovan Hutton Pulitzer. Now, anybody who knows anything about writing knows the Pulitzer Prize. Is this guy tied in with the Pulitzer Prize, or what's his angle? What are you talking to him about?
Well, Jovan Hutton Pulitzer, if you've ever used barcode technology, which we all have on the phone, that's basically his patent. If you've ever seen dynamic screens on your computer, if you go back to the 80s and 90s, you had one size computer screen and you had to basically change the slide to move it over. He was behind that. He's got hundreds of patents. But the reason why he's a big deal is he's the gentleman that basically said, with all of the controversy going on over these Dominion voting machines, we can get rid of the smoke and mirrors. Give me your paper. And so he's got this technology that does kinematic artifact scanning, where he can grab a hold of a paper. He can tell you if it's been folded. He can tell you where the paper came from. He can tell you whether a smoker handled it. He can tell you whether there was a pre-printed marking device versus ink. And so he's the scariest man for anyone that's worried about fraud. And the reason why he's so dangerous is in 28 states in our country, we use Dominion machines. New Mexico's one of those states. And the pitch to get those machines in here, because you use electronic interfaces when you vote, was don't worry about the electronic interface because you can always have access to your physical ballot. Well, wouldn't you know, not one state in the entire country has given up those physical ballots to be audited. So he's able to do that. And so right now, the reason why I want to talk to him was he's leading the audit in Maricopa County, 2.1 million ballots. And it's not one of these crappy audits where you run the phony ballots through the phony machines. He's getting the paper. He's going to do this kinematic scan, and he'll be able to tell us one way or the other. And so he's important. That interview that I did with him's got nearly 400,000 views. People really, really want his technology. And if that domino falls in Maricopa County, I think it has to, basically we have to see those similar audits in other states. And that should be accomplished within the next 30 or so days.
So like I said, we've been talking about here, you've been talking to a lot of people about the results of the 2020 election, and you think there was there was voter fraud on some scale. So why don't you share you talked to all these people and any other people that you found especially informative, any interviews that are on your YouTube channel that you think people should go and look at, but more importantly, kind of what was your journey in coming to these conclusions? Were you concerned about voter fraud before the election? Trump talked about it. Did you think that was
No,
serious
no,
issue?
let's put it this way. I was concerned with voter fraud because voter fraud happens, but it's usually so small a scale that um, you don't really have a sense that that's really going to truly determine the election. What I saw here was election fraud, and election fraud's different. So you either have an absolute violation of the law, which had happened where you basically had secretaries of state changing the rules because of COVID. And when you do that, um, well, fair enough. But if your Constitution says that the legislature has to be the body that creates your rules for setting the time, place, and manner of your elections, in almost every one of these states, it wasn't the legislature that made the change. It was the Secretary of State, which is illegal. So on one front, people were suing, saying, "Look, you violated the Constitution. We can't honor this election." Then there was the other element, and this was the fraud element, where people were worried about that. I think that's a very, very legitimate claim, but it would take days to explain all of it. And then there's a third front, which was what Lynn Wood brought up, which was basically a diminution of your vote, because if another state doesn't follow their own laws, and we're in New Mexico, it affects us. But he actually drilled down even further and talked about how the leniency shown towards absentee voters. Basically, they loosened the standards so much that you basically created a tiered system that violated equal protection, meaning that the requirements for voting in person were much more stringent than the requirements voting by mail. And so that was another challenge. So you basically had three different challenges that went before the courts, but invariably none of the courts would do evidentiary hearings on the fraud claims. And so this led to this myth that there wasn't any evidence, and that's just simply not true. They didn't have any evidentiary hearings. They dismissed the cases on standing, and this should sicken people because even the president of the United States, who's on the ballot, was rejected. The president of the United States was found to not have standing. This is insane. That was the ruling. But be that as it may, it was the ruling, and so I got more and more involved initially through my legal analysis of what was going on. I looked at all the cases, I tracked them, but I became more and more frustrated because I'm a trial attorney, and I put on dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of witnesses on the stand, and I know the standards for what it takes to get someone to testify. And the reason why I'm so persuaded is we have over 5,000 affidavits that were filled out by people that observed voter fraud. 5,000 sworn statements. These people are risking the penalty
This is
of perjury.
across the country?
Across the country.
Okay.
You also had 12,000 reports, incident reports filed that the RNC is in collection of. So you could presumably get another 6,000 affidavits from that. You had stuff that happened in Antrim County where there was a 68% error rate, where basically these bad ballots were being kicked into adjudication. And what you need to know about that is once they're in adjudication, it's not you, the voter, that verifies where your vote went. It's someone else. It's an independent contractor that usually works for a company like Dominion. So we're seeing error rates where 68% of the ballots were getting kicked to a file where someone else got to vote for you. And that has been proven conclusively in Antrim County. And we're seeing that in other places like Fulton County. That was where we had the infamous video of Ruby Freeman and her daughter pulling out hundreds and hundreds of ballots after they told Republican poll watchers to go home. And they're rerunning and scanning the ballots. And conservative estimates was that they were able to run at least 18,000 ballots during that time frame, which was greater than the margin of victory in Georgia. And so we're seeing this everywhere, but most importantly in those 7 states that had dueling electors, and New Mexico was one of them.
So I do want to get into some of the critical race theory stuff, but I want to conclude this discussion. You've talked about a lot of things that could be happening or will be happening soon with regard to audits of the election. You still think there are shoes to drop or other information to come out that will illustrate this point more clearly? I mean, so I'm open to it. I'm no expert on elections. I come from the policy background, and that's my prime interest in general. But I'm willing to consider these things. There's no question that the media were taking fact-based or even made-up things and pushing the narrative against Trump. I mean, obviously this whole concept of Russians paying money to the Taliban to assassinate American soldiers. It was reported widely, not true, just found out to be not true. A lot of the media was geared towards, of course, Hunter Biden and the laptop, downplaying anything that would hurt Biden. We've seen James O'Keefe with the videos talking to CNN, where they're saying, we're trying to get Trump not elected, and we're trying to now turn our attention to climate change and global warming. How do you think this will all shake out and go down in the history books if there is an honest accounting for the 2020 election?
If there's an honest accounting, then President Trump is the president, and this is coming from someone who's not Republican. I'm as we mentioned, I'm more of a libertarian, but there are many states that showed up as blue that I firmly believe were red. And so when we look at the statistical data, when we look at just the overwhelming evidence, my biggest problem is that this never got to the American people. And it's because of the media outlets like CNN. It's the people in charge of Twitter. James O'Keefe, or is it O'Keefe? I think he's the gentleman with Project Veritas.
Yep.
He's the one that recorded or had recorded all of these interactions with CNN producers that were basically admitting to the media narrative of propaganda to let people know that they were trying everything possible to ensure that this president didn't get another 4 years. And so, I'm not into conspiracy theories. I'm basically into the rule of law, and the rule of law is broken. Because if you've got personal knowledge, that's all it takes. If you've got personal knowledge under Rule 602, you can take the seat, you can take the stand. And you've got 5,000 people that are willing to do that, and they weren't given that opportunity. On January 6th, we were supposed to have the last opportunity to hear about evidence of voter fraud, and that didn't happen due to the riot. As soon as Arizona objected to the electors, and that was when, and they were able to do that, there was an opportunity to present evidence, and then you had what happened there. And every single Republican that said they were for a full hearing on the fraud on the 6th basically turned tail and sold the president out. So I'm upset with that, but at the end of the day, I've tried cases against criminal organizations. I've tried cases against drug trafficking organizations. I know what evil looks like. I know what it looks like when people are covering up their tracks. And I've never seen anything like it. Am I hopeful? Well, I have to be, because if I'm going to be a cynic, nothing's going to get done. I'm not going to despair. But this is not something we're going to be able to legislate ourselves out of. If people think that we're going to fix this because of a ballot initiative in 2022, I'm sorry, we're past that. So what I would like to see is justice starting with Maricopa County. If I'm right and there's widespread fraud due to the paper itself, no smoke and mirrors, if that domino drops, then we're going to have justice. And I don't mean just justice from electoral reforms. People should go to jail. That's my position. People should be prosecuted. I think there's been treasonous behavior here. But the scope of corruption, no one, including myself, could have conceived that it would be this bad. And so I would encourage your listeners and yourself too, Paul, because I know that you're a very reasonable and rational person, to look at the sources. You don't have to listen to me or take my word for it, but listen to these people, listen to the experts, because if you're listening to CNN or even Fox News, you're not getting the whole story.
All right. And you've got a lot of interviews with a lot of different people. And I didn't mention Sidney Powell. She's another one that one of Trump's election attorneys who certainly made news for the release the Kraken, those statements.
She'll be vindicated, Paul.
Okay.
And that's the other thing. She really was never a Trump attorney. This is the other thing you have to know about Sidney Powell. She was the gold standard for the better part of 30 plus years. She's brought 500 appeals to the Supreme Court, 350 of those as an assistant U.S. attorney. And before October, if you would have asked anyone about Sidney Powell, they would have thought they would have told you she's one of the greatest appellate attorneys we've ever seen. And just like that, because She had the nerve to fight for election integrity. People have turned their backs on her. She's going to be vindicated, and I think she's going to be vindicated in the next 2 months.
So, a couple quick things before we leave that topic and go to the critical race theory. One is, would you point anybody to one or two? Because you're in the long form interview business. I mean, Tucker Carlson's a couple minutes, but your podcast, your interviews are 50 minutes, an hour, or even more. Are there any specific ones that you think really get to the heart of the issues that you're trying to talk about with regard to the election?
Sure. Well, let's point out that some people have done heavy lifting before I did any of these interviews. But
Okay.
Mike Lindell, love him or hate him, I love him.
The My Pillow guy.
My Pillow guy.
Did you interview him too?
I haven't, but he's
Okay.
put out 2 documentaries, and he's putting out a third. The first one was Absolute Proof. The other one was Scientific Proof. And the other one is, I think, Proof of Foreign Interference was just coming out. Now, he gets on credible experts. The problem with it is Mike Lindell's the My Pillow guy, so he's doing the questions, and people are like, well, I don't know if I can listen to this guy. But the witnesses and the evidence that are presented during those documentaries, there's hours. So he's basically compiled upwards of 5 hours of material. But closer to home, I would ask them to look at my interview with Joshua Merritt. He's a white hat hacker who actually filled out 4 of the affidavits that Sidney Powell relied on. He proves the foreign interference in very compelling fashion. I think the Jovan Hutton Pulitzer one is a must listen to. If for no other reason, it's low hanging fruit, because if people don't want to buy that there was election fraud, fine. But what's the argument against letting someone like him do the audit of the actual physical ballots? And I haven't heard a compelling reason to do that. But those 2 I would start with. And then if they want to look at the other cases that I've done just from a legal analysis, there's a website that I link to that does a thorough breakdown of 80 plus lawsuits, and they can figure out what's real, what's not. But the salient point with the legal analysis is that no court in the country actually held an evidentiary hearing about any of the claims.
Now, the hacker, I believe the title of that one is Dominion Machines Exposed by Hacker. You don't mention the name of the guy. I just want to be clear of that. And you can see the picture. I did start watching that one the other day. Of course, it is a 2 hour and 52 minute, I believe. 2 hour and 52 minute video. So definitely detailed, but bring some food and snacks, because you might be there a while.
Well, I mean, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. If we do these short ones, the experts will all say, well, he didn't bring up this, this, and this. And so even though we did it a nearly 3 hour interview, we still had people that wanted to hear more. So I'm going to try to do a follow-up, but he's in high demand right now.
Okay, so we've got 7 or 8 minutes left, and the issue of racism, critical race theory, obviously looms large over a lot of things. As you probably are not aware, we are located in downtown Albuquerque. The foundation is. I've already told my employees, and I'm already stating that when if we go into work or are aware that the Chauvin verdict will be released on that day, don't come to downtown Albuquerque to work, because I very clearly think there will be serious issues. We had, of course, riots relating to the George Floyd thing. Albuquerque City downtown, it's never the hot spot of Albuquerque. Let me tell you, it's gotten much worse. I mean, COVID has shut a lot of the businesses, and then you had the riots, which broke a lot of windows, and so you had boarded up workplaces all over the buildings, all over the place. It was really nasty. But you, in your videos and in your work, you've taken on critical race theory. Talk about what that is and how it's really being used in today's society.
Well, yeah, critical race theory is repurposed Marxism. That's all people need to know. In Marxism, I know everyone's going to quibble over the textbook definition. Basically deals with an oppressor-oppressed worldview. And historically, that was done through class warfare. You've got the rich, the poor, the proletariat, the bourgeoisie. Here it's been repurposed to have that oppressor-oppressed narrative, but not on class or social structure, but on race. And so it's effectively what was done under Adolf Hitler after World War I, and Germany basically got a raw deal with all treaties bringing them back into the modern world. They were able to create a racial dynamic between the pure German and the Jewish person. And look at what happened under the Reichstag. Look at the way that Jewish people were targeted. Here, if you look at the history of critical legal theory and critical race theory, it's hard to use the class warfare model in America because we've had too much prosperity and there's too much mobility from the classes, and so not a great place if you're going to try to promote Marxism. But race is a different issue. We've had a tragic history in our country going back to the Civil War before that, and then you had the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. So it's still fertile soil, and that's what the Marxists have basically grabbed onto. And so what you're seeing here is primacy at work, where you basically accuse the other side of something. You accuse the other side of racism. And if you deny it, well, wouldn't you know that's a racist thing to do? And so right now, we're seeing buzzwords like unconscious bias, white privilege. And so you're basically presumed guilty without any proof. And if you try to fight back and say that I'm not any of these things, well, that's just proof that you're racist. And that's the culture that's pervasive through all universities, including New Mexico State University. That's the battle. And what it does is it creates tension, it creates divisiveness. And we've got people now that are going to HR meetings and trainings apologizing for something they can't control, which is the color of their skin and their gender. So that's the backdrop. I think it's evil. I think it's a disgusting doctrine. It is explicit racism against white people. But some white people seem to be okay with it because they carry a level of guilt because of the sins of our country, and that's understandable. But I'm a proponent that you pay the punishment for things that you've actually committed in a court of law. There needs to be evidence, and under this theory, there doesn't even have to be any evidence. You don't even have to be conscious of what you're doing, and you're presumed guilty, and that's how dangerous it is.
Yeah, and there is a law that passed, HB 43, in the New Mexico legislature, titled relatively harmlessly the Black Education Act, but it definitely has some language in it that seems to set up not just universities, but schools across the state. The title says that it recognizes and teaches Black culture and anti-racism. And anti-racism doesn't mean what you might think, not you, David Clements, but you, the listener, might think it would mean. Anti-racism is essentially a stand-in for critical race theory. So now this has been enacted and signed by the governor in New Mexico.
Yeah, you've got with the anti-racist, they've got you completely cornered. If you say something and it's the wrong something, you commit a microaggression. That's hate speech. And if you don't say anything, they're calling silence violence. Mm-hmm. And so what you have to watch out at the university level is the creation of these diversity councils, which are basically snitch tribunals. And you've got this woke mob that's looking for people that are violating these microaggression standards that everyone violates. Everyone's convicted. It's just a matter of who the woke mob's going to enforce it against. And that's why it's so dangerous, is that if you're white and you're breathing, you're guilty. That's a hell of a place to be in a university setting. And it's expanding from the university setting to the corporate structure, the corporate world. My wife is an engineer with a prominent engineering firm, and they're having the same types of trainings where everyone has to admit to their complicitness in institutional racism. And I think, well, that's just a recipe for disaster.
Now, in New Mexico, of course, we're a heavily Hispanic state, and you hear the term white Hispanic or something like that. I mean, even the shooter up in Boulder, Colorado, was labeled by many on social media as being white, and then you find out, oh, he's actually a Syrian Muslim, which it's it's an issue that just because you're not white, it doesn't mean that it's not going to affect you. I mean, it could affect anybody, including African American people who might do things that are not in line with the woke mob. I mean, people like Candace Owens and others, so I just want to clarify that this whole theory is not necessarily just a racist theory. It's really another tool to bludgeon political opposition.
Yes, and maybe it's an simplification to say that it's just white males, but basically what you have are intersectional groups that are given the greatest platform, and so the more that you can be broken down into either a trans, leftist, queer, minority group, you'll have a heightened platform for people to listen to you. And if you're not in one of those legally protected intersectional groups, basically you're told to shut up. And what people don't realize in New Mexico, because it's, you're right, we have a Hispanic majority state. I mean, when you look at governor's race, you look at the legislature, you've got a lot of Hispanics that are serving. But this is starting to blow up in unexpected ways. So we have a high school where I live, Oñate High School. Well, Oñate is not white, but because of some of the cultural implications of where he came from, there was a big push to strip the Oñate High School name, and it's no longer Oñate. It's now Oregon Mountain School. Well, ironically, guess who named the Oregon Mountains? Oñate. So are we going to strip and not call the Oregon Mountains the Oregon Mountains? Or are we just going to call them mountains? It's almost like the Washington football team. We've got these generic names. I go to high school. Those are the mountains. That's all we've got left, and that's a vestige of the problems with the woke mob.
Yeah, of course, Oñate was the statue that was taken down here in Albuquerque. I don't know if you've been up to Santa Fe, the monument on the plaza, that was destroyed. And yeah, it is a very frustrating and difficult issue, but we don't have much time left. I do want to talk about something you mentioned earlier. Hopefully it's a very quick conversation, but you said that 50% of the staff and students you think at NMSU might be Trump voters. Now, I'm willing to give you the benefit of the doubt, even if it's only a third, but do you really think that New Mexico State University is a bastion of maybe conservatism among higher ed?
I said staff. So,
okay, staff,
so if
not students.
And I'd say students, but when you think of the academic professor, I'd agree, no.
Okay.
Absolutely liberal. If they knew better, they wouldn't have hired me because of my viewpoints. But I'm there. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the people that take care of the grounds, when you take a look at the people that are working at the snack court, your janitors, these people resonated with someone that really connected with the working class. There's a reason why union members were so conflicted about Trump, because he spoke to them in a way that they haven't spoken to a long time. So you've got the political parties that are pro-union, but he was more blue-collar, middle-class worker than anyone. The student body is, by and large, come from conservative families. And Doña County may be a little bit more left-leaning, but you have to understand, we're a county of farmers, agriculture, engineers. We're much more conservative than Albuquerque or Santa Fe, and a lot of these families. Even the Democrats are what we would call Kennedy Democrat families. They're conservative oriented. So while they might not be registered as Republicans, I think their values are predominantly conservative. And I think many of those people voted for Trump, but they would never say it, because you're going to face the same consequences that I did, which is you're going to be ostracized and you're going to be called a racist. But I'd say it's a 50-50 split. And I can back that up with the thousands and thousands of emails I got from students, faculty members, people that work there that didn't want to go public because they don't want to take the heat. But my critics are few. My supporters privately, there's a large population, and many of them are at NMSU. And the reason why I still have a job there is because I've had so many people working behind the scenes to keep me there.
Well, I admire your courage and your willingness to say things that are not very popular in the majority opinion, not just the media, but even I think there's a lot of consternation and concern about, looking too deeply into 2020's election among, conservatives, Republicans, et cetera, people who might have voted for Trump but just don't want to go and do the legwork and rehash all that. Before we go, any final words, David?
Yeah, well, the final word, and this is my pitch to Paul, because Paul's good to me, and I appreciate you bringing me on, is policy follows law. And if the legal system's broken because we can't trust our elections, then good luck with electing the people that we want to enact good policies. And so I'd ask people to face uncomfortable truths. You don't have to agree with me. I don't want to make up your mind for you, but you can go to theprofessorsrecord.com. I've got 2 websites dedicated to evidence aggregation, and you can look up the affidavits yourself. You can do key searches and satisfy. It's not something you're going to be able to do in an hour. You're not going to be able to do it in weeks. There's that much evidence out there. So I would challenge your listeners to be critical thinkers, much like Paul challenges his audience to think critically about policies and economics, to do the same thing about the evidence in our elections.
All right. Well, thank you, David. Good to catch up, and congratulations on all of the informative and interesting interviews that you've been doing. I'll definitely do some more digging. Too much material to get to in a day or a week, even. It's a lot, but I admire your passion and all the information. I'll definitely look into it. So, all right. Well, that will do it for this week, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of Tipping Point New Mexico. You can find all the episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.